Test, test. Okay. Maybe a question to the audience who just came late. Are there still persons sitting in the food court and eating? So, I mean, just chatting, right? But would you think like we need 5 more minutes to wait for late incomers? Or yeah, there are some late incomers. If you're okay. Yeah, then I will just talk a bit about the session. So, you are here in session 214R. Modeling socio-ecological systems across scale. So the motivation is that myself, Melvin, Jue, Hedwig, Rahmat from C4 in Indonesia, we use a lot of modeling, but we feel like the current modeling approaches maybe needs a new tweak. And our new tweak would be cross-scale approaches. So what we mean with cross-scale mean that the model has to do at least, for example, local level, like a watershed, and it needs to link dynamically with a regional or provincial or maybe national level. So what we see, however, often is like scenarios which are global, and then they are simulated locally. This is not what we call cross-scale. This is a zoom-in. So we really want to have these feedbacks, and that's the take of our presentation. Can you go to the next slide? So we have 5 presentations. These are 3 10-minute presentations, and we have 2 flash talks. From our counting, we have some time to discuss, and we have some flexibilities. Given the lessons learned from the past day, we decided that we want to move the question and answer to the end. So we will have more like a common question and answer session. And we also have posed 3 questions. If there's time, we would be happy to discuss with you. What do you think about it? And then we can change now to Jordan. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Wait for this. Okay. Hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here in Oaxaca with everyone to talk a bit about some of the research myself and some of my colleagues have been working on, which is maintaining and restoring nature's resilience, defining critical thresholds for terrestrial ecoregions at a global extent. Where do I aim it? Got it. Okay. Yes. Okay. So, as we are all aware, we are facing an unprecedented nature crisis where loss and degradation of terrestrial land is pervasive globally. Nearly 1/3 of all land is degraded in some way, and so guidance for how to prioritize limited conservation resources to effectively mitigate pressures to nature and restore nature to maintain resilience is more urgent than ever. And the importance of land and its use is supported by its inclusion in nearly all major global international conventions, including those to combat desertification, global biodiversity framework. But kind of the need for this work to define these ecoregion land thresholds stems from the fact that a key question that remains even amongst many of these key global conventions or restoration strategies is actually defining what nature needs in specific places, and how much is enough in terms of both avoiding further ecosystem degradation and loss, as well as how much is enough when it comes to restoration actions that can effectively help the system to either return back to a stable state if a threshold is crossed or is close to a threshold point and resume normal functioning. And critically, land is also, of course, important to support livelihoods, including for food security. Well, I think I went too far. Okay. So in order to tackle this, through collaboration with primarily members of the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich and the Universidad de Complutense de Madrid, we generated a reproducible approach and methodology to derive thresholds for terrestrial ecoregions that could be replicated at a global extent. So specifically, we developed this modeling approach that integrates XGBoost machine learning models and a series of nonlinear regression models to identify at ecoregion level, any thresholds that might exist for a set of chosen indicators for terrestrial land that are representative of the primary stressors and causes of land degradation globally. And ultimately, these thresholds are intended to serve as a safeguard to describe at what point we might expect an ecoregion to be in danger of significant loss of stability and normal functioning if that threshold is exceeded. And then this can be used to inform the level of restoration and regenerative action that may be needed to maintain stability in that ecoregion or restore it back to a zone of higher stability. Okay, so kind of zooming out a bit, when we're talking about defining what nature needs, we're really zooming in on that spatially explicit level. So it has similar principles to the work of the Earth Commission on those safe and just Earth system boundaries, but we're really trying to get down to this bottom-up, replicable approach that defines at that ecoregion spatially specific scale what are these thresholds if they exist, and can they also be contextualized at that place-based level. Okay, so quickly, these were the key pressures that we identified through an extensive literature review, reviewing some of the major global conventions, like the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the sorts of indicators that are used to assess and combat degradation. And those were converted to state indicators to be used in our modeling approach. And I will talk a little bit more about this in a second. And then, so in these threshold models, we're trying to understand, is there a threshold for these indicator variables of degradation in relation to the ecosystem state? And so to represent that ecosystem state, we use a measure of ecosystem stability. So this actually indicates the temporal stability of vegetation status in a fluctuating environment, and it's often used as a proxy for stability of ecosystem function. It requires time series data over a long period to be used for regional and global analyses. So we used time series of NDVI from MODIS from 2000 to 2023, and the metric is essentially derived taking the average of NDVI over the standard deviation to understand the level of stability. We did transform NDVI to KNDVI that's thought to be more closely related to productivity on land and also not subject to some of the issues with NDVI such as saturation or bias. I am going way too slow. So, I'll be quick. So these, I can go over this more, but these are the sources we use. So we have to use global data sets because we are working at the global scale. And we're working at the ecoregion level. I'll just leave it at that so I can keep moving through this. And so this is just a schematic of the approach that we've been developing. Essentially, there's 3 different scales that you can assess this at in our modeling approach, and it integrates with a Amazon Web Services, so a cloud platform for efficiency. Essentially, you can train the models at the biome level to get biome thresholds, at an ecoregion level to get ecoregion thresholds, or train at the biome level and derive thresholds for individual ecoregions. Okay, really quickly here. So often machine learning models are seen as black boxes that are hard to interpret. These SHAP values that we use are a way that is being used more often now to kind of change the narrative on that to more easily explain the process of machine learning models. And so we take these SHAP values, which essentially they explain that the individual contribution of each predictor variable on the given model prediction. And so just when you look at the plots, you can just sort of see trends in that, but then the next step is to actually do a series of regression models to see if there's actually a threshold relationship in between those predictor variables we're interested in and that stability metric. So I'm just going to say there's several different ones, and we use the BIC to inform which is the best model. So either the slope or the intercept might change in these models, and it informs which one's the best with BIC. And so quickly, SBTN. So one of the main reasons why we started this work was to inform the science-based targets for land. this is what a science-based target is. For those who don't know, it's a measurable, actionable, and time-bound objective based on the best available science that allows actors to align to Earth's limits and societal sustainability goals. And specifically, this is key for the science-based targets for land. So thresholds are key to defining that level of ambition of a target to make sure it's based in what nature needs in specific places based on the best available science. And just to note, many probably know we already have one version out, but these thresholds are meant to be integrated into what will be version 2 to be at least completed in 2025 to add that place-based science and justification. So it's a multi-step process to be as robust as possible. There is a process to take the values from our models, cross-check them with reference values from literature, including the Earth system boundaries, and use a precautionary principle, since we are guiding action by companies, to pick a stricter value to ensure that we're thinking of the whole range of the potential limits for these indicators in these systems, because all models have considerations, and there's always uncertainties, and we want to be as thoughtful as possible when we're informing how companies limit their effects on nature. And I just want to mention, so this is highly important, so I'm sorry I'm speeding up at the end here. A big part of scaling this work, especially when we're talking about the place-based level and the local level, is actually considering localized priorities and livelihood considerations when we're working on the ground to ensure equitable and just outcomes. So some key questions to ask are, how do we contextualize these thresholds to the landscape level? And how do we best integrate ecoregion thresholds with local priorities and livelihood needs to guide effective and equitable action? And I'll just mention that we did start exploring this in a workshop that CI led last year in collaboration with our CMRD and our Africa Field Division in Nairobi, Kenya, thinking specifically about Narok County, which is where the Masai Mara Reserve is. It's a critically important place for nature and for local livelihoods, and this workshop really was meant to engage in this multi-stakeholder process to inform on the challenges and opportunities, to integrate and achieve multiple goals for people and nature at that scale. So essentially, what do these ecoregion thresholds mean at this scale, and also what are the other considerations, key pressures and needs at that local scale that we need to consider when trying to use this work at a local landscape scale. Okay, so that was super fast, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you, John. Right in time. Like I said, please keep the questions until the end. I would now hand over to... Yeah, there's already a correction, right? It should be Hedwig van Delden. This is the one which comes after you. No, but Miguel is already talking with the IT person. Yes, that's correct. Muchas gracias. So Hedwig, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Melvin, and welcome everybody. The work I'm presenting is a collaboration between a few Dutch organizations and an organization in Madagascar. And it's funded by the World Bank with the main aim to really develop an integrated modeling platform to think about better understanding implications of both climate change and socio-economic development on socio-economic and environmental indicators, and also really to think what policy and planning could do to improve the situation on the island. The idea was not to just have the modeling platform, but to run scenarios to better understand the value of the model, and also to do some activities to implement the system in institutions in Madagascar. Well, as you might know, there's really a lot of issues going on in Madagascar. It's a lovely place, but it's really, there's a lot of poverty, a lot of deforestation going on, a lot of land degradation. The whole idea of the project therefore was to both work on sustainable land management and policy alleviation. And I think an extra aggravating factor was really the large population growth. So it goes from roughly 30 million now to 55 million in 2050. So it's really immense. We started off with doing a workshop, and we discussed what should be the inputs and the outputs of the modeling. So key drivers, both climate change, socio-economic developments, and then key strategic output variables across land use, but also crop-related, nutritional value, erosion, environmental issues, and the ability to meet nutritional requirements, and the ability to escape the poverty trap. To make sure the system was relevant for policy and planning, as part of the drivers, we looked at different plans relevant for them, if we could model those and get some extra drivers based on those planning documents and discussions with national policymakers. So what we thought in the middle, there the question is, if you have such a complex system, do we also need complex models? And actually I know there's a lot of debate going on this. For us, the answer is actually yes! And so where we ended up with is this thing in the middle. The brown part is all the modeling. So our spatial extent is Madagascar, spatial scale is national, regional, local level 300 meter grid cells, temporal horizon 2050, resolution monthly for the biophysical processes, yearly for the socio-economic processes and land use, and building blocks. We really tried to work with existing models, but we also found we had to adapt them to the local context to make them workable. So to quickly show you a bit here, I don't think the pointer is that clear, but if we start on top, we have population growth that is distributed amongst the different regions. So there's regional interaction, possible migration between different regions, and there's a feedback between these regions and the local level modeling. So the local level modeling is where population and economic growth are allocated on the land use. Within the aquaculture areas, there's a farmer decision model showing the different household types and the crop choices and management decisions. Those choices impact on our biophysical models. Our biophysical models calculate, that feeds back into the land suitability, all at local level, and that feeds back into the land use. Then there's also a big impact on the regional interaction model, because regions that are more attractive, they attract more of the migration. So I just thought to pick up of two models inside of the system to explain a bit what we're doing. So in terms of land use, we first have a CA-based Metronamica model, really to allocate the generic land use classes, so urban, forest, aquaculture, etc. And what is important there is the accessibility, transport, and zoning, protection of the rainforest, and that can be both weak and strong protection. So what comes out is a series of annual land use maps. So on an annual basis, this information is fed into the farmer decision model, which is an agent-based model, and that has the aim to simulate crop and management decisions within those cropland areas and calculate the nutritional value or the profit, depending if you're a subsistence farmer or also selling your product. And it also has a household dynamics model, which simulates across 6 different household types, as you can see in the bottom. So on the one hand, we have subsistence farming with some cash crops and really commercial farming. And the other part of the table says if they have an off-farm income or not. So how diverse their family income is. And well, I think it's quite obvious that the lower groups in terms of economic of income and wealth are the subsistence farmers, and sometimes also the subsistence farming with off-farm income. Main difference between the one column and the other column is farmers with off-farm income are normally located close to the urban settlements because of the accessibility to other types of economic activity. So, going a bit deeper into this farmer decision model, starting with the household in orange at the top. So we first allocate the household based on the population growth, and households here are still urban and agricultural. They give us our food demand. Then we have the agricultural land use demand based on the local population plus the exports. And then the agricultural land use demands gives us our household allocation, where people, the farmers, are going to live in the areas, and it decides based on their farm typology what kind of crop choices they have. They make a choice for the crops and the land management, and that also links into how much yield they can generate based on the biophysical conditions. And that comes again to the agricultural production and profit, which feeds back in the next cycle in the household dynamic, so they can go from one household type to the next if they produce enough, or they can also go back if their production is not enough, they go back to subsistence farming. Important links in the more dark brown is that the regional model gives information on the households. The export feed into the total land demand for agriculture. The land use model says spatially explicit where agricultural areas are. Our vegetation model gives input into the crop choice, how much can you actually make, and also in the actual nutrition calculations. And then here on the left-hand side, we see dynamic suitability for the spatial allocation of the growth of households and socioeconomic feeding into this crop choice model again, both in terms of prices, subsidies, cost of management practices, etc. So outputs of this farmer decision model are, well, if you see the pictures up there, we have a cropland area from the land use model, filled in with different household types, and then also different crops. And at the end of this calculation, and once the biophysical model is calculated as well, we have the nutritional value if you are just a subsistence farmer, or also the profits if you sell your crops, and that is then aggregated and used in the processes at regional and national level. We also know the gap between the demand and supply of the crop yield and the household changes for the next year. Then thinking about the different scenarios that we tested, we had a baseline scenario, business as usual, where actually there's a really weak protection of the forest and also a low agricultural production. A RED Plus scenario where the forest is protected and there is reforestation and there is agriculture intensification in the buffer zones to stop people going into the forest. And there's an agriculture intensification scenario which more focuses on the economic potential, has more accessibility improvements with development goals, and focuses on more the poverty alleviation side. I'm not going to present all of it, just a very quick flavor, and if you want to know more, just let me know, and we have a lot of reports to share. So, just as an information, baseline results, evolution of the households. What you can see in color, the different household types. The two on top are the subsistence farming and the subsistence farming with some extra activities. And you see all households are evolving over time, so a lot more development in the island. Forest area evolution has, of course, then the opposite almost, a decline because a lack of space. Then if we look on top, so organic carbon, 2020-2050, a lot of decline in environmental values, not only of the carbon, but also NP and K. And then at the bottom, we see the fraction of the population that doesn't meet the nutritional requirements, and also how much they miss them. So if we look at the region all the way at the bottom, we see that it's actually half of the people don't meet the requirements, and they don't meet the requirements by roughly 40%. So it's quite serious. Then the idea was, well, we have some nice scenarios to counter this. Can we really do that? And what we have learned from our scenarios, and I just took the main messages together here. So the high population growth really puts a lot of pressure both on the forest, but also on the environment in general, thinking about depletion of the soils. And efforts in RED Plus really help to improve the protection of the forest compared to the business as usual, but they're definitely not enough to stop deforestation. So we are only limiting the deforestation, we are not countering it at all. Then agriculture intensification helps to increase the productivity, and also there are much more households that can then meet their caloric requirements. What is, however, really important here, if we want to go from subsistence farming to subsistence farming with a little bit of cash crops, there has to be some seed that helps people to go and take the first step. Because without this first incentive, it's very often not possible to start producing more and intensifying aquaculture. So we see that already with a 10% increase in crop prices for farmers, we can double the profit, and subsistence for households with cash crops can do quite well, but it really depends on the region. And so although we have a lot of interventions, a large part of the growing population doesn't really surpass the subsistence level. Final conclusions. For our scenarios, what we saw, we really need to kickstart livelihood improvements, and that's critical improving the environment, but in turn, having a good environment is critical for improving livelihoods, especially for the subsistence farmers who are dependent on the environment. So co-creation of integrated models for policy support is really important, so really working together with those who need the models. Model integration, I think we really like that it shows feedback between the different processes, different disciplines, different spatial skills, and making it dynamic. But then one key message, I think being able to couple models technically doesn't mean that the coupling makes sense. And I think we should avoid focusing too much on technical coupling and too little on really understanding the processes. So the final one, I think, for us is there's a real big challenge in once we develop the system and giving some training to actually implement it in Madagascar. So thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you very much, Hedwig. Yes, then we will hand over to Miguel. And Miguel will have a flash talk. For the timekeeper, as we have a bit more time, we provide the flash talk speakers 5 minutes. That gives a bit, 2 minutes is also not that much, but nevertheless. Yes, Miguel, then please.
Thank you. Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm here from Mexico. So let's talk something that is happening here in Mexico. Where do I point? Yeah? Okay. Let's be clear. Bark beetle outbreaks. We are worried, but because somebody says that they are dangerous, but that's not quite true. They are part of the forest ecosystem for a long time. So they are the only thing that they that is we are worried about it is that they are suffering the same thing that we. The factors that drive their distribution are changing. Of course, they cause tree mortality. That's why they are. We are care about them. But several factors have been changing that exacerbate mainly the frequency, severity, and spatial extension of these outbreaks. The factors that have been reported in the literature has been massive, and mainly they can be grouped in intrinsic factors and external factors. I will talk about external factors, the ones that are more related with the environment. Tree mortality is mainly focused in to provide forest succession. Also, the bark beetles are great because they provide they pump the nutrient cycle. The factors that are often mentioned in the literature are vast. I like to draw you to some of them, mainly the topographic variables, and of course some variables that are related with climate change growth. These variables are said that promote decreasing health of the trees, tree health, and increase the susceptibility to bark beetle outbreaks. So we try to, and with this study, we try to evaluate how the interaction between drop events and some topographic variables are related. We use a Bayesian spatial temporal modeling. So we use data over a period of 30 years, and we mainly try to understand how the spatial temporal patterns of intensity of bark barrels are changed to this area. We mainly use it slope aspect, relative position on the slope, and topographic wetness index, and draw occurrence at different lags at different times of the year. This is the distribution of the outbreaks. It's a rational one. We are trying to figure out how these patterns are moving through to the space, and this is how they are increasing. Now that we are worried that in the 2021 we have this peak that wasn't expected. There are some ideas that people are trying to move this they are trying to extract more wood and try to promote bark beetles in those areas. Oh, come on. So we try to obtain the distribution of the density by making a grid. So we count all the outbreaks that happen in those areas, and try to obtain the spatial autocorrelation and temporal autocorrelation. The temporal autocorrelation was mainly significant at some years, mainly in the and 2016 and 2019 and 2021. They are increasing, but we also find a quite heterogeneity in the patterns. Overall, we found that the landscape modified the patterns. Mainly, I would like to draw your attention to those arrows. Mainly, the drop events in previous 2 years and in the third years promote bark beetles intensity. They increase. They have the message is that we have to take care. If we have a drop in this year, we might be a really problems. Okay, well, that's good.
Do you have one?
No, just one. Yeah. Well, this is the key message. Bark beetles take advantage of trees in topography and in favorable areas. These promote greatest stress during drought, but the results were heterogeneous. We mainly have to be worried about the months that where the droughts might be in months might be dry and warm and dry and cold. We were working with 4 species, and we think that this heterogeneity is in the result might be related to those. That's it.
Miguel, thank you very much. Then we come to the next flash talk. Simon.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me here at GLP. I will present very briefly sort of the state of my current work. I work at Tunen Institute, and a colleague of Melvin who's organizing the session. Tunen Institute is a federal research institute in Germany, so we mean to produce science, but also policy advice. And so yeah, I'm going to talk about regional modeling of LULUCF potentials in Brazil using a soft-coupled local approach. And so what do we mean by that? So we're focusing on the EU Green Deal policies, and these policies may lead to decreasing agricultural production and also production of wood in the EU. And what are the consequences? So the consequences could be that this causes production shifts, production leakage to third countries. And what are the problems with that? So we are in our research group, we are developing then scenarios on the EU level. So how could this EU Green Deal be implemented on the EU level? And then we think, in this case, we're looking at two countries in our project, Brazil and Indonesia, but this is mostly now about Brazil. But which scenario do we meet in Brazil? So if we have production leakage from the EU to Brazil, which scenario would this meet within Brazil? And do they like it or do they do not like it? And so we call this then a top-down and bottom-up approach for our land use modeling. So the top-down would then be the scenarios from the EU, which go into a global market model. And the bottom-up would then be a rather more participatory approach than from the Brazilian side to understand what is actually the reality on the ground then that would meet, where these two scenarios then would meet. Methodological framework. So on the top-down level, we have the global market modeling in our institute. They use Magnet and GFPM, so for agricultural and forest products. And Brazil has a vast variety of agriculture statistics that can also be used for this rather top-down approach. And for the bottom-up, so just 2 weeks ago, we did a workshop on the possible scenarios on the ground in Brazil, the state of Mato Grosso, I have to say, with our partner organization IPAM in Brazil. And I also did some stakeholder interviews and field visits just to understand better what is the prospects for the time 2022 to 2050 in Mato Grosso, and then ingest this in my land use modeling approach. For the scenarios, to help to see a bit the discussion, I developed 4 scenario narratives, and I used AI image generation to create some provocative images that steer them discussions with workshop participants. So we could, in Mato Grosso, we could see something like a sustainable growth scenario where we both have increases in production and conservation, but it could also be the complete opposite, a climate calamity scenario where we have decreasing production due to climate change and decreasing yields and expanding agriculture and less conservation. Also, an agribusiness rules scenario, so rather like a business as usual scenario, or a conservation paradise to focus on conservation. And actually, participants they were quite pessimistic, and they voted that the most plausible scenario for Mato Grosso would be the climate calamity scenario. Interestingly, talking rather than to governmental representatives, they were more optimistic and would rather go for the sustainable growth scenario, surprisingly. A bit of the modeling framework implemented in Python. So we used Glamondo by Van Asselen and Verboek and converted it into a Python environment. And for our land cover data, we use Mapbioma's land cover data. So this is a business as usual scenario, just an extrapolation. This is how Mato Grosso could then look like in 2050. And we also then aim to do a carbon sink potential estimation and use national carbon inventory for that, and both from biomass data and also from literature data. So, for example, in this case, going from 2022 to 2050, this would be the difference then in the carbon stock. And now forthcoming work now would be to integrate these EU scenarios then with the Brazilian scenarios and see what these combinations of global and local scenarios reflect in land use, land cover maps, and finally also in differences in this carbon stock comparison to have an indicator of potential carbon leakage then. Yeah, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Simon, also for keeping the time. So, yeah. Yes, then we come already to the last presentation, and I try to keep my presentation less than 10 minutes, so I hope we have time for some discussions. Yeah, so my name is Melvin Lippe, as Simon said, Thünen Institute of Forestry, National Federal Research Institute in Germany. But I'm actually a modeler and remote sensing scientist. I'm not a policy advisor, but somehow that's also my role. It's a funny role sometimes. I find it controversial too. Anyway, that's another thing to talk about. Okay, so the background of study, actually I liked the first day keynote, the last one. He talked about the global potential of restoration and that he found it quite a critical issue because it can lead to competing claims. So that's also the motivation of the model development we did here. So if you look on forest landscape restoration globally, the analysis results are different, or let's say the diversity is high and low. That means the potentials can be high, they can be low. Then what you also see, like you have country commitments, you have the bond challenge, other kind of commitments. And however, the feasibility of these large-scale country, sub-Saharan commitments are still somehow uncertain. Of course, it takes time to develop and plant trees. And on the other hand, these areas are also smallholder-dominated landscapes. That means these smallholders have, of course, another objective. They may be subsistence-driven, like in Hedwig's case. And they're also now facing climate change, so there are climate change mitigation issues. There are government policies on ecosystem services and carbon stock. And at the end, what does it mean? It leads to competing claims of land. And I mean, this is one of the main points of land system science. And so the study objective here was that we wanted to develop a spatio-temporal modeling approach focusing on these smallholder-dominated landscapes. And in case of the PhD study of Sonja Holler, who is the co-author, she focused on restoration area potentials, which we call RAP. It's not hip-hop RAP, but it's restoration area potentials. So we developed a spatio-temporal model in Python. It's available in GitHub now. The paper was studied in the beginning of this year. And what we did actually, apart from Python, we have a PC raster Monte Carlo framework. So basically we use Monte Carlo suitabilities to optimize the landscape per time step. And from that we derived then these RAP or restoration area potentials. So if you would go to the GitHub, you would have the Python, the Monte Carlo, but also R analytical toolboxes where you would just plug in the time series and then you click on the code and it takes about, depends on the size, 10 to 20 minutes. And you get actually R-based maps and also time series figures. So what we also tried to do is we tried to represent forest in a disturbed and undisturbed way, because what we see for models like Clumondo, forests cannot change over time dynamically in these approaches. You have to define the land use types in the beginning, and then you just replace them with each other. That's a cellular automata. But here we used above ground biomass thresholds to define the disturbance level, and then depending on like harvest of wood, it would go into disturbance, it can be a succession stage, and so on. It's not an agent-based approach, but I call it smallholder functionality. We have some emergent properties, which is driven by population, time series, and then if a certain number of households per pixel reaches a threshold, a settlement is developed. And then this over time has influences, of course, on demand, like on food. As we're doing a long-term simulation until 2100, we integrate climate change periods. So this is like the global approach we downscale. And then we link it now bottom up with the population growth, land footprint, which means food diet demands, and also settlement dynamics. So settlements can grow over time. Now we have also a street network included. It's a bit simplified, but also to keep that accessibility point in mind. So, well, let's discuss about it later. So we think it's a different scale or multi-level approach, because we have this global climate change period, but we have local interactions built up in the system. So for the model development, we use a case study in Ecuador called Esmeraldas Province. This was part of a research project, and Esmeraldas is, in case of Ecuador, a target province for forest landscape restoration. The reason is the socio-ecological system is high deforestation pressure, while on the other hand you have about 25% forest conservation zones. So you have already these kind of dichotomy, and then you have still like the smallholder dominated land uses, which has of course other goals in the land use system. And in case of Esmeraldas, maybe a challenge which we did not take into account, it's a border province, and there are also illegal activities, for example, with neighboring countries. So the baseline scenario settings, great, so I'm well in time. We use SSP2, middle of the road, and RCP 4.5, so emission scenario. And you can see here, so in this case, we assume that global emissions would peak by 2040. Yesterday I saw that ESA Copernicus just reported this year will be the first year where we will definitely pass 1.5 degree. So this RCP 4.5 is already history, I guess. But this was part of the model development, so this is what we built in. According to SSP2, the population peak in Esmeraldas will peak about 2060. And what does it mean in case of Esmeraldas? It means pasture and agroforestry will increase, as you see on the right side. However, woody biomass, which is fuel wood, will decline over time because of innovations and change of energy types. And also the smallholder share will decline because population will also, after 2060, will peak and then altogether decline. So, as I wanted to keep it short, I just present basically two results. On the right side, you see these dynamic maps. So, if you download the GitHub, you can also produce GIFs directly in our approach. So there's a Python submodule where you can directly produce these GIFs, which is a nice feature for presentations. And on the left, you would see the output of that REP, restoration area module, where we would estimate the potential of restoration area in 2100. And based on this model assumption, you see that it's mainly agroforestry driven restoration area, because agroforestry would be the assumption it provides food and it provides also energy or wood demand. So I don't want to go into too much details, because I rather thought it's good to discuss and open up the discussion with you, the audience. I just want to conclude that that model we developed called LPB-REP combines Earth system approaches into one system, and we link it with land system theory and then a smallholder functionality, which is not ABM, but it has emergent properties. So it's kind of in between. What I did not talk here, what we did for this presentation, we increased food demands for a person to 3,500 kilocalories, which is not realistic, of course, but we wanted to see what happens if food demand changes with the restoration area potential. And what does the model suggest? It would suggest that forget about forest landscape restoration. You have to wait until your population peak, until you first fulfill food demands, and then you may consider to start forest landscape restoration. That means, coming back to the beginning, forget about your country commitment in case of Ecuador, because you have to focus on something else. Food, subsistence, rural development, and forest landscape restoration. Maybe later, or maybe you have to give a lot of money to those smallholders, as we learned on the first day, that they lock in the land for forest landscape restoration and not use it for food production. So here we see that it would lead to a 10-year delay from 260 to 270. So, as I said already before, using an RCP45 scenario is not realistic anymore. But the model allows you to change it now, so it's open access, it's open source, you can download it. And I just wanted to make that point again on the right side that from a modeling point of view, I think if you think about land systems, we need to keep the climate aspects more and more into account, the feedback mechanisms, like our land use models, like also what Simon presented. We don't do that, but this increases the uncertainty of future land use change a lot. And yeah, with this, I want to thank you. That's the GitHub. You can also use the code. Email us if you have questions or feedback. And then let's open the discussion for the last slide of our introduction presentation. So we prepared three kind of questions. First of all, if you have questions to the presenters, that's the right time now. Otherwise, we could directly jump into this one and have a reflection with you, because this would be also the minutes we would prepare to conference organizers. Hedwig, would you like to be in the front? And I will just walk around. There's a second one at the front. So I will walk around, Hedwig, and you can share.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just a question about your results there. And, I think this is badly needed to have local scale land use decision making in these carbon potential assessments. I just wondered, how much did consideration of local scale land use dynamics decrease or always alter the assessed potential? Did you run a scenario where you kind of removed the representation of smallholder dynamics just to have your kind of baseline potential assessment?
Well, that's an interesting question. So you mean I wipe out smallholders in my model and I just make a top-down
Yeah, because if you kind of ignored local scale land use dynamics and you've got a kind of top-down technical assessment, right? That would give you a baseline of the kind of assessments we otherwise see in the literature, and then you could look at the difference between the two and be like, once you start thinking about local scale land use, this is how much the potential changes.
Yeah. Well, that's an actual interesting point. So we can do it. It's open-based code, so we can just switch it off. That's correct. It's an object-based model. In the paper which we published, we have different scenarios like no conservation, weak and strong conservation. So in the no conservation, it is a kind of business as usual trend extrapolation, but the assumption remains the same. It's a smallholder dominated landscape. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Okay. Thanks. Well, this is a broad question. Is there a specific question for a particular? Okay. So my broad is to pick up on the across-scale aspect, because this is not a criticism, because I have tried it myself. Impossible. But how do we... I felt like if we want to get feedbacks across scales, what do we need to do in this second question here to get that better? Because it is really difficult, and I feel that I didn't see it very much in these presentations, which is not criticism. It's just, if we want to do it across scale, we need feedbacks across scales, and how do we do that? I don't know, Hedwig, for example, in your model, could you consider how production influences population and how that then feeds back? I think you had population coming from a separate kind of sort of component.
Yeah, so I agree that it is a challenge, and also to see where it happens. I always think we should go back to the processes that underlie at both scales. So in our model, we go indeed from population down to local level, and I think that's a very common approach. I think the top-down happens all the time. What we do as well in terms of migration is that we take indicators from local level. So the more productive areas, more people migrate to those areas because of the better livelihood opportunities. So in that way, our local level information feeds back into the regional level.
Yeah, I could also respond on that. We have been discussing that also in the Lawrence workshop some years ago. So one take for us was that, of course, locally you have micro processes, and if you move up, you need to decide which of them become relevant, like what you did a bit in Crafty, right? So it's actually the question related to the first presentation about to define that threshold. And then coming back to your question, it's like, when shall the model decide when I switch on and off? It's unsolved, and one take for me is nobody likes to do it because it's so complicated. No project will support or fund you that, and it's a long-term development. So you need to start it, and it takes 5 years or so, and you need a lot of crazy people who've spent time on that. But yeah, that's why we are here. So that's why we wanted to talk with guys like you. So yes, this would be one feedback maybe for the conference.
Yeah, maybe just to wrap this up, what we also do actually is we have integrated models where an economic model gives the demand for land that is needed, but then based on the resources available, there's a feedback from the local level. If there's not enough demand, then the demand from the economic model is not met by the supply locally, and there's actually an adjustment to the economic projections at the higher scale. Maybe go to the next.
Yeah, that nicely introduced my question. Thank you very much. I was a question of understanding. I didn't know that there's an economic model really underlying it, because I didn't understand this nutrition issue with the calories, because people, if they earn more money, they can import food, buy food from other places, and that way save land or invest in technology, so improve yields, and then there will be some, endogenous innovation, higher yields, less area. So how is that all accounted? I know it's difficult, but did you include that in the model?
Yeah, if I look specifically for our case in Madagascar, actually once households go from the subsistence level to subsistence with cash crops, then we've already gained a lot. So then everything works as you say, because at that point in time they can start buying things and food from elsewhere. But the biggest challenge is to go from that first step from subsistence farmers who might not even have enough for themselves to subsistence farmers that can sell a bit. I don't know the others, if there are others who want to respond to that.
Well, I can respond to that last model. So we have no economics in. We used the calories as a land footprint approach, because we want to develop further the economics. And the footprint is basically a transition stage to move from go to economics, but now have the calories as a demand. And what I did not present, we would then have trans-regional leakage, meaning if the demand is not fulfilled, the model will say, well, you need actually to get more, or people move out migrate. You have a question?
So I have one question actually for Jordan and Miguel, because I also noticed the modeling approaches presented in this session are very different. I'm just wondering for machine learning, because the rest are process-based, sort of you represent the mechanism, but for machine learning you don't. You just have variables. Especially now you have a workshop in Masamara. What is your approach, or for Miguel also for discussion? How can you represent local adaptation or different behaviors in different regions back to this global machine learning model?
Yeah, I think that component of it requires more work, and it's something we're looking into having more kind of pilots of that, hopefully with our global programs at CI, to look into that further, because I agree one of the outcomes of that workshop was essentially that these subjects are extremely complex and difficult to communicate, especially to multi-stakeholder groups. And so the way that I sort of see the scaling in this sense is sort of a mixed models approach, like at least in the format that we have these machine learning and threshold models, there isn't a direct integration of the learnings from the stakeholder engagement into the models. It's more of understanding what are the key pressures in those areas and priorities to potentially determine what actually are the variables that we need to focus on in those local areas. Are there additional variables that we need to consider? And yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
So just for the announcement, this would be the final remark of the event because we are at 2:15 and I think the next sessions are waiting. Miguel?
Yeah, thank you. I'm using a Bayesian approach, so I'm certain that I can use previous information. Also, I can incorporate guess what people believe about the process. This approach is quite flexible, so I can incorporate a lot of information at several levels of the belief. So I think that there's room for using this in more specific areas. So I just can say that, but actually I didn't do that. I think it's really really a problem.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We're now going to wrap up. So thank you to the speakers and the organizers, and also to you for your nice questions. And enjoy the rest.